All right, let's bring in our panel of political strategists, Graham Morris and Bruce Hawker. Look, he wouldn't be the first or the only politician to have a harsh view of journalists. There's nothing new. But Graham, you and I live in Canberra. The Canberra Times is his main target here, right? He said that they're, too conservative. He prefers to get his news from Crikey. Is that how you describe the Canberra Times?
It's sort of what happens when you have a prissy chief minister with a glass jaw. You know, the Canberra Times, 25 days out of 30 would give him a fantastic run, better than any leader it gets all around the country. And for 5 days out of a month, he might get a slap over the wrist. But it's quite extraordinary. You know, this is sort of a Labor town, certainly recognised as a Labor newspaper or Labor-leaning newspaper. Not a Labor newspaper, but Labor-leaning, with Labor-leaning journalists, with public servants Labor-leaning, and he's crying. And you think, oh, fair go, mate, get a backbone.
I mean, Bruce, I'm not sure if you agree with that characterisation of the Canberra Times there, but how wise is it for any leader, not just to have a crack at the media, but in essentially a one-newspaper town, to cheer on the closure of that newspaper?
Yeah, I don't get that at all. Look, in the Australian tradition, it's very difficult to go to war with the newspapers. I've seen it attempted on numerous occasions in the past. I remember when Neville Wran went to war with, I think, the Sydney Morning Herald, and that ended in tears for him. And he was a very powerful and influential politician. I think the Chief Minister would be better off just quietly walking away from that one. That'd be my view.
Yeah. Yep, well, he doubled down today, issuing a more detailed statement explaining his position. But anyway, let's move on to the more nationally focused events today. The tariffs win for Australia. Malcolm Turnbull out there today, straight to Port Kembla, to the BlueScope Steelworks, who are very happy as a company that we've won this exemption. Graham, what do you think the lessons are for Australia, for the government, for corporate Australia as well, from this whole exercise?
Well, I think you're right. The Prime Minister certainly is out there today, and he's really quite excited about this, and so he should be. And look, one of the lessons, I think, is to have a Prime Minister who thinks that no still means maybe. He kept going on this, and Minister Chobo did a good job, and Ambassador Hockey, a fantastic job. So you need that sort of troika and a little bit of luck. I think you also need to understand the psyche of Donald Trump. He sort of needs bad guys. And on trade, initially, it was Obama was the bad guy. Then China was the bad guy. Then everyone was the bad guy. And then somebody said to him, hang on, there's a lot of good guys like Australia. And they make stuff. For example, the Joint Strike Fighter, the most technically advanced machine human being has ever made, sort of an American plane, but we make bits for it out of steel and aluminium. And that applies to a hell of a lot of things. And I don't know what he's going to do about cars, but, a lot of the steel and the aluminium for his cars are made offshore. But he needs a bad guy. And, I suspect, and he would be loving this, I suspect he would have said, well, look, if we do this thing on steel, what's the worst anyone can do with us? And they might say, well, the Europeans could take us to the World Trade Organization. And he'd say, oh, really? Yeah. You mean somebody would take me to court to for standing up on American jobs? How do we make this happen? He is confusing the people in the Republican Party mightily, but he's destroying the Democrat base.
We saw him, Bruce, over the weekend, heading straight to Pennsylvania for his part, Donald Trump, and, the crowd there lapped it up. This is going to play well for him in those Rust Belt states, no doubt about it.
For sure. And that's, of course, is where he won the 2016 election campaign. You remember that Hillary Clinton basically didn't campaign in places like Pennsylvania and paid a high price for it. And that's just one of a number of states in the United States that have been in this rust bucket category for decades now. So it would play out just as well in Australia as it has for Malcolm Turnbull. And frankly, in election campaigns that Graham and I have been on opposite sides of the fence over, we've played exactly the same card when it suited our respective political parties' interests. Jobs for Australians is a very, very powerful message, and rightly so. Now, the fact that we managed to get a tariff exemption in the case of steel and aluminium, I think really goes very much to the fact that Australia is such a strong ally of the United States. I mean, anyone who travels to Washington or anywhere in America knows that Australia has, I think, it has no rival in that respect. We are so closely aligned with the United States.
Is that, Bruce, how it should work? I mean, we fight alongside the US, I think, in every major war for 100 years. Look, getting a break on steel tariffs isn't the reason why we necessarily do that, but are the two inherently linked? Is that why we are being given this exemption?
Well, I think it's part and parcel of it, frankly. I think he probably set out at the outset to say, look, I'll put a blanket tariff out there and then we'll see how it plays, and I'll play favourites with some of my friends and get some brownie points along the way doing that in respect of countries which don't really... Well, actually, some of these countries are very significant, Mexico and Canada as well, in terms of tariffs. Australia not quite in that category. But I think that would have been part and parcel of his thinking, that he would throw out a blanket ban and then he would selectively exempt certain countries with whom he's got a good relationship.
And Graham, how does this work now? I mean, yes, there might not be any sort of, we'll give you this, you give us that, formal agreement, but will there be a payoff, a payback at some point down the track?
Well, we don't know is the real answer, but it wouldn't be unlike him, I don't think, to say further down the track to say, look, I helped you there, can you help me here? As to what that is, nobody has a clue. But certainly he has, one of three, he's done us a bit of a favour. You could argue he shouldn't have done the stupid thing in the first place, but that's not the point. He's eventually done the right thing, and the Prime Minister's quite entitled to be thrilled.
Now, I'm keen to get both your thoughts in this final week of the South Australian election contest. Very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen there. The Xenophon SA Best party seems to be trailing away in support, according to the latest polls. Bruce, what's your best judgment on what's likely to be the result on Saturday night?
Well, you remember the Queensland election recently, where we basically had three parties contesting, One Nation, Labor and the LNP, and they were basically getting, a third of the vote each across all those electorates. It's going to play out like that in South Australia. True, Xenophon's vote has dropped, and dropped alarmingly, I think, from his perspective. That in part, I think, is because now he's running candidates who probably are a little bit eccentric and probably haven't gone through exactly the sort of vetting process you might want to do. And this is a highly tactical election campaign.
Is it also a question about what ideology draws you to a party? I think with One Nation, you could say, there's an ideology on immigration or whatever it is. With SA Best, is there a founding, ideology that draws those candidates to stand and carry that banner?
Well, it's none of the above sort of ideology. It's not really an ideology. It's a bit of populism, and he is a populist figure in Australian politics. We all know that, but he obviously hasn't gone out to that extreme right or extreme left form of populism. He's certainly, though, appealing to people who've said, look, Labor's been in for 16 years and the Libs have done nothing in that time as well. Time for a bit of honest, straight talking politics. And that's the sort of image that he's tried to present. I think he'll pick up a few seats, and it's going to be tough for Labor if he does hold the balance of power, because I think it's always harder to ask a person who holds the balance of power to come in and support a party that's been in government for 16 years for another 4 years, rather than give somebody else a chance to form a government. Now, that'll be the tough ask for Labor. But from what I hear... I was going to say,
Graham, it's still quite... Yeah, sorry, Bruce.
No, go on. Sorry.
David, it's going to be close. Certainly the Xenophon vote will decide some seats. Those early polls that said Nick Xenophon and his crew could govern in their own right were just downright stupid. A lot of those Xenophon people, I hope they haven't walked away from their jobs, and they'll need them again on Monday morning. It is true that a lot of that Xenophon vote is splitting back to the Labor Party and back to the coalition, as you would expect in a polarising election where it's going to be very close. But he will, I think his people will decide who governs. But there's also this other thing, and that is, finally the Libs have got a message and they know what to do when they govern. And the Premier is essentially saying, look, I got the state into this deep poo and have dug it this big black hole. Please vote for me so I can dig the hole deeper.
Yeah, well, he's got some slightly better... His message is a little bit more appealing than that. I think it's about jobs growth and
no, it's about fixing the mess he created.
And I'll tell you, one of the interesting things that's coming out in this campaign, which is sort of counterintuitive, is that renewable energy in the form of batteries being produced by Elon Musk is now actually becoming a significant plus for Jay Weatherall and Labor. Now, you wouldn't have thought that would be the case a few months ago when South Australia was having its blackouts, but now that is actually turning into a vote winner for him. So on the night, it's going to be fascinating. I think everyone should be watching Sky on Saturday night to see how it unfolds.
We will all be there. Indeed. I'll have both of you there.
Yeah, big night.
And we've got the Batman by-election that night as well. We were talking to Stephen Conner.
Labor should get 58% of the vote.
Well, maybe they should, but it doesn't look like they will. Bruce, you first on this one. What do you think? Can Labor still hold this seat?
Oh, well, I think they can, but it's going to be tough because the Libs aren't running a candidate, so all those Liberal voters are going to have to make up their mind whether they want to vote for a Green candidate or a Labor candidate with a union background. If they decide they're going to vote Green, and there are some indications that a lot of those Liberals are going to go down that path, then that'll be an interesting portent for what happens in the state election in Victoria. If the Libs start pulling out of these inner city suburbs and electorates altogether and leave that up to a Green versus Labor contest, it'll mean that we'll see more Green members of Parliament most likely than we have in the past, and that'll be potentially a big challenge for Labor in forthcoming elections. So that's something to watch on the evening. But how it actually pans out, I'm not sure. Jed Carney is a strong candidate, and with all great due respect to David Feeney, he probably was not an ideal candidate for that sort of an electorate, which is inner city, trendy, green, leftish. He didn't fit that mould at all inside the Labor Party with his public sort of persona. So Jed Carney does, and I think it'll make for an interesting night, but who knows how it'll pan.
Yeah, Graham, what do you think?
Look, I genuinely think the Labor will get about 58-59% of the vote, and if it's anything short of that, they want to do a bit of navel-gazing as to what on earth went wrong. Bruce is right. David Feeney was a terrible candidate last election. The Greens candidate has run, oodles of times before. Everyone knows her and doesn't want her. And how in that seat, next door to Will's Bob Hawke's old seat and next to Jenny Macklin's old seat, Jenny Macklin's seat, you would think, oh, fellas, 58, 59, 60%, if not, or they're not
and
trying.
What do you say, Graham, to the argument that, the Liberals aren't running, that hurts Labor because you're not getting that directed preference flow, and Bruce's point that maybe if the Libs start pulling out...
They'll split. They'll split. Some will go to Jenny, some will go to the Labor Party.
But do the Liberals
few will go to the Greens.
Do they have an obligation to run, or is that crazy in a seat they're never going to win?
An obligation to run? God, no. Well, the Libs couldn't win. Why would you waste money in that seat when, you've got a state election coming up, federal election next year, and spend the money properly in seats that count? Well, and I think that's the big difference this time in South Australia. Last time, the Libs did not focus on the marginal seats properly. This time they have.
Well, I don't think that's actually the reason why they're not running a candidate. I think it's highly tactical. Highly tactical. In the words of Shakespeare, what brave new world is this that has such people in it?
You wouldn't suggest the Liberals want to inflict that sort of political pain on Bill Shorten right now. But anyway, we'll find out Saturday night with both the South Australian and Batman by-election results. I look forward to talking to you both in the studio for that one. Graham Morris, Bruce Hawker, thank you. We'll see you then.